So I thought it was important to kind of give an insider's view from what I think is the majority view, that people disagree with the ESG agenda, but they just, they have the problem of being canceled if they speak out about it.
My name is Mike Mauceli, and this is the Energy Show with REI Energy, where we're energizing your investments and maximizing your tax deductions. Today, we're going to be talking about the truth about ESG from a Wall Street insider. And you're going to discover how ESG hurts investors, businesses, and doesn't even help the climate. Instead, ESG is used to control the world's financial system and pick winners and losers. My guest today is Paul Tice. Paul is a Wall Street veteran. He also teaches at the University of New York, and he is the author of The Race to Zero: How ESG Investing Will Crater the Global Financial System. Great to have you on the show today, Paul.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for having me.
So you wrote a book, The Race to Zero, and where you talk about ESG investing and how it's going to cradle the global financial system. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, sure. So one of the reasons why I wrote the book was because up until now, you haven't heard anyone who's worked on Wall Street really issue a critical opinion about ESG, and that's by design. You're not allowed to criticize if you work within the industry. So I thought it was important to kind of give an insider's view from what I think is the majority view, that people disagree with the ESG agenda, but they just, they have the problem of being canceled if they speak out about it. And that was something that I experienced towards the tail end of my career. And I also wrote the book because I think even though we've had some pushback on ESG the last few years, which is all good, I think the focus has been a little misplaced. Rather than focusing on woke issues and what's going on in the corporate boardroom, we really need to focus on climate change and the net zero agenda, because that's the heart of ESG. And if we're going to do that, we have to focus on the energy sector, because that's the primary target of sustainability.
So when they came up with the name ESG, and that's environmental social governance, right?
Right.
And then, of course, you have these huge financial firms on Wall Street and like BlackRock, who, has kind of embraced this strategy. So are they finally starting to push back on it, or are they just still going full bore, with this climate initiative?
Yeah, I think what you've seen is a tactical retreat over the last year or so because of the pushback from mostly red states. We've seen a number of Republican states that have pulled money from some investment advisors, primarily BlackRock. And obviously, there's been a lot of criticism in the press. So I think what you're seeing is a tactical retreat. You see some of the firms withdrawing from these net zero alliances, but I think that's more to minimize their legal liability, because clearly there's a collusion problem and an antitrust issue. So that would be easy to sue a lot of these financial firms. So I think what they're doing is they're basically biding their time until regulations come from the government that makes the entire system mandatory.
I see. And, as far as Wall Street, or at least the CEOs, I mean, how do they benefit from ESG?
Well, I think there's enough money to grease the skids here, which is why people are going along. You can raise an ESG or sustainable fund, charge higher fees on that. You're not really doing a lot of incremental work. So there's that. You can underwrite, green bonds, right? So, there are ways that you can make money, but I think the majority of funds and investors are basically being exposed to expense. It's increased overhead expense to basically police this entire ESG system. And it's being applied to every fund, even if you're not labeled as a sustainable fund, which is a fiduciary problem. So I think net ESG is a huge incremental cost for the system, but there's enough people who can make money on it, both within the industry and then all the advisors that you have that have sprouted up to basically advise you on ESG ratings and scores and your proxy decisions. So there's a whole cottage industry of that. But I think for the most part, it's a net negative. And for companies, it clearly is just a cost up front for an unclear payback. They promise you that ESG will lead to better financial performance and create financial value down the road. They never tell you when you get to the end of the road. And there's no data that shows that that's ever going to happen. but we do know that this all has an upfront cost. So, it's a negative for investors and companies.
Well, I know a lot of, 401ks, self-directed IRA, directed IRAs. They're kind of required to, invest in ESG, some ESG products. And, from what I read, those products have not been too successful, but yet they're forced. A lot of companies are forced into this, correct?
Like I said, the ESG system is compulsory. Every firm on Wall Street, certainly on the investing side, is a member of the United Nations advocacy group, the Principles for Responsible Investment. And if you're a member of that club, you are required to integrate ESG into all of your funds. Not just new funds that have an ESG label, all of your existing legacy funds. So that's happening now through the back door, which again is a huge fiduciary problem. So it's already happening and people aren't aware, and the capital that you give to a lot of these companies is being leveraged unknowingly, I think. So, there's a huge fiduciary problem when it comes to that. So, but, most of the firms that are doing this, I think are doing it not like BlackRock because they're a true believer. It's because the CEO is afraid to speak up also, right?
Yeah.
Because the whole system works. It's like a natural gas pipeline system, right? A high diameter pipe. The entire system's under pressure in order for it to work. So ESG is a very pressurized system. So even the CEOs are under the gun not to speak out, because then you become a target. Your annual meeting will be filled with protesters, right? You'll have a protester at your headquarters building. You'll be targeted, maybe in a proxy battle, right? Maybe your board will be turned against you. So there are a lot of CEOs who are doing this because they're afraid to speak out as well. So we need to relieve that fear factor and all the pressure on everybody.
Well, I know when you talk about oil and gas companies, like Exxon, for example, they have a lot of environmentalists now on their board, and more companies are starting to see these environmentalists start to infiltrate their board of directors. And so, is it all just about money, or is it basically, is climate change kind of the crown jewel of it?
Well, I think it's, again, there's enough money to grease the skids, but
Right.
it's not going to lead to improved value down the road. And the argument that's being applied to the energy sector, it's ridiculous on its face. They're telling oil and gas producers that you need to focus on green energy and stop doing what you have a competency in, right? And that'll make you a better company, right? Obviously, that doesn't make any sense. And it's the same for a lot of these other companies. You should spend more on higher cost renewable energy because it'll save the planet, even though it destroys financial value for you. So with the energy sector's companies, they too are under the gun, and you can see that they really haven't aggressively pushed back on this. And I think that's a problem, right? Because they clearly are the primary target, and they have a great platform to speak out more, right? And Exxon, as you mentioned, has been a prime target of all of the environmental activists. But this is about control. It's about controlling the financial markets, about controlling every company. And by using the argument that you have to follow this progressive agenda, it's a way to use moral duress and indirect government pressure to control the private sector, right? So it's called stakeholder capitalism, is kind of the euphemism for ESG. It's not capitalism. It may be the end stage of capitalism if we don't turn this thing around, but it's more closely aligned with fascism or socialism, right? It's the government directing the private sector and the financial markets indirectly using, third-party activists, and now it's going to be government regulators who are doing the pushing.
So when you see some of the new elections that's happened around the world, for example, France is now looking at a different candidate, and there's Argentina, who has elected a new president, and more of them are right leaning. Do you think more and more people, population is pushing back on all these woke agendas and these ESG governances that that they're trying to push not only here in the United States but everywhere around the world?
I think those are hopeful signs, but I don't think we should underestimate the other side has been at this for 40 years, right?
Yeah.
This really goes back to the 80s. And frankly, you can go even further back because I think, ESG is just another anti-capitalist movement. So you can trace this all the way back to Marxism, right? The only difference between Marxism and ESG is that with Marxism, they tried to control the means of production through the labor function. Now they're trying to do the same exact thing through the capital function. And I think that's going to be much more effective. If you can control and direct capital in the markets, given the amount of money we're talking about, you can control the entire global economy and every individual, their economic life and everyday freedoms, right? So, I think you can look at it both ways, but clearly the other side has been playing a long game. And since the 1980s, the United Nations has taken on climate change, sustainable development, and also ESG in terms of verticals within the organization. And all three of those things are intertwined. Climate is the core of sustainability and ESG. And ESG is the funding mechanism for the climate change agenda. And that's not me just saying that. All you have to do is listen to all of the officials from the United Nations. When they speak, they clearly are telling you that this is all about implementing the climate change agenda. So I think to your question, Mike, there are hopeful signs, but again, I think we'll have to see where this goes because, we obviously, the federal government here now is controlled by the Democrats, right? And so they're directing policy. So this election in November, in many, many ways, is going to be key again, right? But particularly key in terms of the climate change and ESG agenda. In Europe, it's unclear whether certain of these countries pushing back or certain candidates winning is going to change the overall momentum, which is very negative. I mean, Europe is the leading edge of, climate change as well as ESG, and they put in place regulations already. So I don't know if we can reverse that, but it's a hopeful sign. And I think it's going to come to the point where, the populations in Europe may start to revolt, both figuratively and literally against the onerous nature of the climate agenda. So hopefully it doesn't come to that, but I think this is just the warning signs. Europe will be the warning sign for the US, I think, in terms of these things going badly.
So when you look at Germany, for example, and you look at these countries that have tried this green energy, and of course they have, failed, even a lot of these offshore wind farms here in the United States that, have been funded pretty much by the federal government through the Green New Deal. And, it was supposed to be a program to help to create more jobs for American, but it looks like they created a lot of international jobs with these offshore winds, and now they're pushing back on here in the United States. I know Shell recently came out and said that the cost is too expensive, and we need to have more money or more tax incentives in order to build these facilities offshore. Not counting, the damage that they do to the environment and the wells and all of the raptors around the world as far as these windmills. I mean these large windmills, but and in the end, even the European countries, I mean, they say they want to go green and they want to do all this, but yet they want the United States to subsidize a lot of these projects around the world. I mean, that's what it's coming to, right? The American taxpayer, is going to end up subsidizing a lot of these international, green deals. Is that correct?
The whole transition from fossil fuels to something else it's not driven by market demand or economics or technology. It's being driven by the political sector, right?
Right.
So it's all subsidized by the government. Most people would not buy an EV in this country unless you slapped on all of the state and federal subsidies that you have, right? And again, that doesn't even factor in all of the logistical issues about charging it and range and everything else, right? So this entire push away from fossil fuels has been driven by the government. And, as you noted, a lot of it, is basically subsidizing other countries. So when they talk about we need to develop, clean energy because it's a national security issue, they're giving money away to foreign developers, right? So
Right.
there's not an internal logic to the entire argument, starting with the fact that we don't have a climate emergency, right? So,
Right.
and if you really were concerned about energy security and reliability and low cost, you wouldn't be electrifying the entire US economy at the same time that we're more dependent on wind and solar generation, which is intermittent, right? I mean, that's going to be a recipe for blackouts in this country. And we've already started to see that over in Europe. And we've seen it in Texas down here back 3 years ago, right? So the
Right.
more renewables you push into the grid, the more unstable the grid becomes. And batteries can't backfill that, right? So,
That's
and
correct.
then we hate coal in this country. We've basically forced that industry over the last 15 years into runoff mode. But overseas in China and India, they have been adding twice as much coal capacity over the last 10 years, right? So
That's right.
it's a two-tiered system when it comes to climate and ESG. The US and Europe, all the developed countries of the world have to implement this onerous economic program. But the third world, including China and India, the developing world, they get a free pass, even though we're supposed to be trying to solve a global problem. So it doesn't really hang together, but it's the government pushing it. And eventually we're going to run out of government money for all of these, new initiatives.
Well, that's my thoughts. I mean, I look at it and I think it's all about the money. It's all about certain groups making money, because when you were talking about China, as a developing country, I mean, they're the second largest economy in the world, and yet we still consider them to be a developing country. And and they've made it pretty clear they're not interested in moving forward. I mean, they may say that they're interested in selling all of these green energy, batteries and everything else to the United States. But as far as, they're building a new coal-fired power plant every day. And isn't coal still one of our main generators of electricity here in the United States?
It's down sharply. I mean,
It is.
and the problem is, and this started under the Obama administration, right? And you've also had a lot of liberal capture of the state regulatory commissions that approve a lot of these new power plants. So, back 20 years ago, we stopped approving coal power plants because, the climate change momentum was turning, negative, right? So, over the last 10 years, coal generation has gone down. Coal retirements will take another leg down or accelerate between now and 2030. And the problem is that over the last 10 years, as we've been doing that, because of the government regulations, we've had flat electricity demand in this country, right? So that's kind of tempered some of the blow. But going forward now, all the talk is on new sources of demand for electricity from AI and data centers. So the projection is that we're going to have increasing power demand. At the same time, we'll continue to close down coal power, and we're not being allowed to replace that with natural gas now, because natural gas has all of a sudden become problematic. It had a low carbon footprint, based on what we were originally told, but now it's a problem because of methane, right? So that's the unique thing about the science of climate. It's forever changing, right? And methane now is a more deadly greenhouse gas, and that they're using the same kind of specious argument when it comes to nitrous oxide to go after the farming sector. Even though that's an even more trace gas than methane and CO2, and all of them together again are well below 1% of the atmosphere. So we need to keep that in mind in terms of the argument being made. But now we're trying to shut down farms over in Europe, in the Netherlands, because we're worried about nitrous oxide emissions, which again don't move the needle no matter how you look at it.
Yeah,
So,
no, I mean, I understand a lot of this, climate change. I mean, we really don't have a problem on climate. I mean, obviously, if you look back over time, the world has gone through, cold periods, warming periods, as far as all the way back to the dinosaurs, right? And, they keep coming up with these different names. Back when I was in the 70s, the world was, I mean, we were going to, basically the world was going to burn up, and then of course, we go through some extremely cold periods, and now it was the hole in the ozone layer. I mean, that was the one of the big things back then, and all of a sudden, we've gone all the way to now what is called as climate change. I mean, they keep moving the ball, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it was like global warming, and then, like you said, in the 70s, we were worried about the next ice age, and then in the 80s, they kind of, changed the narrative, and now it's climate change, so that every storm that you see is proof of the theory, right?
Yeah,
And,
yeah,
and there are a lot of people who forget their history and don't look at the data, but storm activity has not gotten worse in this country, right? If you go
it's
back
true.
100 years, and again, we need to be going back thousands and millions of years if we want to have an idea of where we are on the continuum. And the argument with climate change is that they use, two sets of data. They use measured data now, that's modern, really since 1979. We've had consistent data, but it's still flawed in a number of ways. And then they uh, attach that to an historical stream, and it's a completely different data series. It's interpolated, and not surprisingly, when you do that, you get a hockey stick. Every climate data series has a hockey stick break in it when you attach the modern and the historical data series, right? Which is only intuitive if you've worked in finance, right? It just tells you you're measuring or attaching two different things. And so there are a lot of problems in the data, even as we measure it now, and we're putting that into models, and it's projecting to the year 2100. And so, crap data in, crap data out. That's the problem. And, too many people are afraid to to question that publicly because they don't want to be called a climate denier, whatever
Yeah,
that means.
so yeah, no, I agree. And I guess another big factor is the 24-hour news cycle, right? Because like you were saying, I mean, storms really haven't gotten worse, but every time there's a storm, there's automatically flashed all over the news and say, "See, we told you so." There's a problem with the climate.
Yeah, I mean, if you look, it's ramping up. And as I talk about in the book, 2030 is a real deadline, for a lot of the people pushing ESG and the climate change agenda. So I think it's going to get more aggressive between now and then. And in the last couple of years, you can see that just in terms of the media coverage of the issue and just your nightly weather forecast, right? They're changing the colors that they use to measure temperature, right? To kind of have that, subconscious messaging there. And now we've developed all these new terms for normal weather phenomena. We have heat domes, we have atmospheric rivers, every night on the local and national news, weather is leading, which is, amazing. I'm not sure if it's the same down in your part of the country, but up here in the Northeast, you know, they lead with weather, with all the
Yeah.
other problems we have in the blue states up here. And they tell you how many people are exposed to extreme weather. And then if you dig in, and obviously they're blaming all of this on climate change. They're
Right.
more explicit about that now. So it's kind of this climate narrative, and even the press is pushing it
Yeah.
day to day in your face.
So if we get a new administration in this year, I mean, will we be able to push back on a lot of this ESG stuff? I know the
Yeah, I mean,
Republicans, they have a game plan for that.
yeah, I mean, it'll be much easier if we gain control of the White House, obviously,
Right.
because of all the executive agencies obviously are a problem, right? But even if we don't win, God forbid, and that'll create problems, obviously, the
Yeah.
red states have been leading the charge over the last few years, and they can continue to do that. But if Trump wins in November, I think the first thing he needs to do is to submit the Paris Agreement to the Senate,
Yeah.
because it clearly is an international treaty. It was never submitted to the Senate because it would never have passed, just like the Kyoto Protocol 20 years ago, right? And it's only been approved by executive order, right? So submit it to the Senate. It doesn't get a supermajority approval, and that should undercut a lot of the regulations that we've seen at the federal level pushing a climate change agenda. We also need to go after, at least the Trump administration needs to go after the endangerment finding under the Obama administration, which
Yep.
found that CO2 is a pollutant that's regulated under the Clean Air Act, right? The Congress had 25 years to do that and passed, right? So clearly that's an arbitrary decision. And by the logic of CO2 being a regulated pollutant, water vapor should also be a regulated pollutant, right? Because it's a
Right.
more effective greenhouse gas, right? So the problem we have with CO2 and methane, nitrous oxide, water vapor, they're all naturally occurring. I mean, we can't tell what part is natural, what part is from the burning of hybrid carbons, right? So I think it was a bad Supreme Court ruling that allowed for the EPA to make that decision, but clearly it was a political decision that was rushed under Obama. And again, if you take that and revise that endangerment finding, that will take out the legs from a lot of these regulations, particularly going after the power plants on the coal side. So we need
Well,
definitely to do that.
I know people in the oil and gas business hope that Trump's going to get reelected. I certainly do, because I don't think we can go through another 4 more years of this. Because when it comes down to it, I mean, the people that get hurt are the middle class and the poor people, right? With all of these additional costs that these corporations are having to pass on, and the higher price for food, because and the higher price for just about everything that we do today, I mean, is directly related to energy. So if you push this green agenda, like you were saying earlier, you're not only going to have blackouts, I mean, you're going to have more inflation, correct?
Yeah. As I mentioned before, I think this gets worse, particularly if the Democrats, whether it's Biden or someone who replaces him at the last minute, if they retain control of the White House, then you're going to see a much more aggressive push by all the countries, including the US, on the climate front. And I would not be surprised to see that they make a declaration of climate being a government emergency starting in 2025. The body language is there in terms of some of the European governments, the UN, the IEA has clearly been agitating for that for a while now. So, if they make that declaration, then as we saw with COVID, it gives them a lot of crazy emergency powers. So I think at that point, it's going to take it to a new level. But the title of my book, was meant to kind of, again, focus people on how serious the threat is. But if ESG succeeds in defunding oil and gas, which is the primary goal, and constricting supply, the price of energy will go up. The price of everything will go up, particularly food, because as you say, energy flows through the entire economy. And that's going to make the inflation of the last 2-3 years look like child's play, right? And the other side will not be able to destroy demand fast enough in order to head that off. So I think, directionally, you're looking at much higher oil and gas prices going forward if the Democrats ratchet up policy. And the problem for everyday Americans is that, as you say, it's a very regressive tax, right? People use their car, right? They like their gas-powered car. It gives them mobility and freedom. And now you're going to be restricting that because of some climate test.
All right. Well, Paul, it was great to have you on the show today, and I'd love to have you back in the future. Can you tell our listeners how to follow you?
Sure. You can see me on LinkedIn and also on Twitter.
All right. Well, thank you again. Love to have it.
This podcast is a presentation of Rich Dad Media Network.